Welcome back to English 2 and our video on our second element of fiction, character. So when it comes to talking about character, there's certain vocabulary that you're going to hear a lot. Some of that vocabulary has to do with how important a role a character plays in a story. Some of it, on the other hand, will have to do with how richly drawn the character is, or how much we know about them, or how much they feel like a real person. The first terminology that we'll want to talk about is major characters versus minor characters, and specifically a particular subset of character types known as the protagonist, the antagonist, and the optional deuteragonist. So what is a major character versus a minor character? A major character is going to be one that, as you'd expect from the name, plays a major role in the story. The story might even revolve around them, in whole or in part. A minor character is a character who plays a very specific, small role in the story, or could even be removed from the story altogether without having to change it too much. If there is one clearly main character, that character is usually going to be what we refer to as the protagonist. When we talk about that plot conflict, that person versus nature, or person versus self, that first person is almost always going to be the protagonist. In the case of person versus person, that conflict is with another person or people. And that person or people that they are in conflict with, usually a single person, is going to be the antagonist. Keep in mind that just because a character is a main character does not make them a protagonist. A good example here is going to be the Disney movie Beauty and the Beast. I'm talking here about the original animation, not the more recent live-action remake. Obviously, both Belle and the Beast are main characters, because their names are in the title, and almost every scene of the movie focuses on one or both of those characters. That said, what is the main conflict of Beauty and the Beast? It actually is not a conflict between the Beauty and the Beast, as we might expect from a romance, because that's fully resolved by, I think, less than halfway through the movie. It's also not person versus nature, as neither of them are really fighting against natural forces or something that is not a person. In the case of Beauty and the Beast, our conflict is almost certainly going to be person versus self. Who is the person that is struggling with their self? That is, of course, going to be the Beast. The Beast starts our story as someone who is selfish, who has a bad temper, who is overall not pleasant to be around. It's important to him to make someone fall in love with him, because that is what will break the curse and make him no longer a beast. His struggle is with his inner beast, his inner failings, his inner darkness. Through his interactions with Belle, he learns to rein that in, to keep it under control, because it is making her angry and unhappy with him. As he does this, he finds himself becoming more selfless, getting to know her better, and falling in love with her. This culminates in him being willing to let her go home to her father, even though they're mere hours away from his curse being made permanent. Because he cares so much about her, he wants her to be happy. Because he has grown so much, he's overcome this conflict with himself and made himself into this selfless person. This is why she falls in love with him, and this is why she is able to break the curse before the end of the film. So even though both Belle and the Beast are main characters, the character journey and the character conflict are the Beast's. So ultimately, it is his story. So we've talked about the antagonist, which, if you have a person versus person conflict, is going to be that second person that the protagonist is in conflict with. The third term that I brought up is a deuteragonist. Sometimes you have two characters who could conceivably be the protagonist. Usually one is more central than the other, but if both characters are having their own conflict and their own growth and their own story alongside each other, we'll often call the secondary protagonist a deuteragonist. One other thing I'd like to talk about is narration. We're going to get into point of view in much more depth later on, but for the most part, in most stories, if we have a narrator, someone who's telling the story from their perspective, the I perspective, then usually that is going to be our protagonist, because that character is telling us their story. That said, there are some exceptions. One of the most famous ones is the Sherlock Holmes stories, which center around the character of Sherlock Holmes. He is the person driving the plot. He's the person who is often changing or growing or in some way driving what's happening. He's the person who is having that conflict. However, he is not our narrator. Our narrator is his associate / sidekick, Watson. So, usually a narrator is a protagonist, but not always. Think about whose story is this, who is driving the story. So, we've talked about main characters. These are characters who are crucial to the story. It could not exist without them. Then we have major characters. Characters who play a major part in the story. And you might be able to remove them, but it would take some serious doing, and you'd have to move a lot of pieces around to do that. And then finally, there's minor characters. Characters who have a very set function in the story, and can either be removed fairly easily, without much change, or could just be removed entirely. One way to think about this is to think of a TV show, and specifically a TV show's credits. Anyone with their name in the opening credits, like those starring roles, those are going to be your main characters. Anyone with their name after the main credits, in those credits that often show up as the show is beginning, those are probably going to be major characters. This is going to be your Law and Order SVU special guest stars, your murderer and your victim. Anyone with their name not appearing until the closing credits is very likely to be a minor character. This is where you get the credits for Screaming Woman in Bank, or Frat Boy Number 2. These are characters who often barely have lines, they don't have real names, they are there to fulfill a specific purpose. In this case, they needed 2 frat boys, and this is the person who is fulfilling that role of Frat Boy Number 2. We don't know much probably about him, beyond that he is fulfilling this defined role in our story. This then brings us to another set of distinctions, which is round versus flat characters, and static characters versus dynamic characters. Round characters are characters that we know a lot about. They are well characterized. We have information about them. We know their hopes, their dreams, their goals. They have personality. They have desires. They have agency. They feel like real people. Flat characters, on the other hand, do not get that kind of characterization. They are called flat because they are essentially two-dimensional. We don't usually get to know them very well as people. TV shows need their main characters to be well-rounded and feel like people, so they need round characters. But TV shows also need flat characters as well. Frat Boy Number 2, we probably don't need to know about his inner hopes and dreams because he's on screen for like 10 seconds. It's fine for him to be flat because the story is not about him. When we're talking about static characters versus dynamic characters, we have a similar set of criteria. In this case, static characters do not or cannot change over the course of the story, or do not change much. Dynamic characters change and grow over the course of the story. Now, it might feel tempting to equate these two sets of scales. That round characters are going to be dynamic characters, and flat characters are going to be static characters. This is often true. You might even go so far to say it is usually true. But there are enough exceptions you do want to distinguish this. For example, Belle in Beauty and the Beast, a very rounded character. We know a lot about her. We know her dreams, her goals, her feelings. Like, she feels like a real person as much as anyone in that film does. That said, her character growth over the course of the film is minimal. She's not really learning any lessons. She's not really changing who she is as a person substantially the way the Beast is. She changes some. Obviously, she starts the story not in love with the Beast and wanting adventure, and she ends the story having found adventure and fallen in love with the Beast. But ultimately, Bella's pretty much the same person at the end of the story as she is from the beginning. The Beast, on the other hand, is a very, very different character at the end than when we see him at the beginning. So, Bella's an example of a character who is probably more on the static end of static versus dynamic, but she's still a round character and she's still a main character in the story. So, now we've talked a little bit about types of characters. How do we find this information out about our characters? What is the process of characterization? In general, there are going to be 4 things that we focus on with characters to learn more about them. First of all, it's going to be the description of a character. What do they look like? What are they wearing? What is their gender? What is their race? What is their style? What are their grooming habits? What is their height? And things like this. Things that either are our physical appearance or are things that we can tell from a description of a character. This is going to include clothes, speech, the manner of speech and the tone of speech, grooming, general appearance. In general, anything you would probably get through a first impression. So one good example of using description to convey characterization is going to be in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He describes one of his main characters, the prioress, a kind of nun, as wearing a necklace with a crowned A. He tells us that this necklace stands for the phrase amor vincit omnia, or love conquers all in Latin. Specifically, amor is romantic love, which if you've taken any of the Romance languages like Spanish or French, should not come as a surprise to you. He is telling us something about the prioress. That she is a nun, yes, but she is also a nun who feels strongly enough about the statement that romantic love conquers all, that she's wearing a necklace signifying that. What are our general thoughts on nuns and romantic love? Generally, it's that they shouldn't be doing it. Like, that's kind of antithetical to what nuns are about. So, by giving us a small character detail of this thing that she is wearing, he's suggesting that maybe she's not the most devoted of nuns, or at the very least, her mindset is not as sober as we might expect from a nun. The modern day equivalent might be a nun with like a 50 Shades of Grey pin or something. Like, you see that and you might wonder a little bit about said nun. The second way we discover information about a character, that we characterize them, is going to be through the character's actions. What do they do? What can we tell about them from their actions? How does what they do differ from what they say? And what does that tell us about them? Our third method for characterization is going to be similar. It is going to involve showing a character's dialogue or thoughts. What does this character think or feel? What do they focus on? What do they prioritize? And lastly, our fourth and final method of characterization is going to be showing other characters' thoughts and dialogue about the character in question. What do other people think about this character based on what they've experienced of them? Often that is less information or more information than we have about them as readers. Often we can learn new things about a character from this. For example, if we're reading about a character who, as far as we can tell, seems very nice, but whenever they're brought up or talked about by other people, they act scared of them, we might begin to wonder whether this person is actually as nice as they seem. We might begin to wonder, is there something we don't know that these characters do? In general, the more you learn about a character that makes them feel like a consistent person, or at least a realistically inconsistent person, like we all are, the better characterized we'll consider that character. And usually they will also be around our character as a result. So what I'd like to do now is for you to take these 4 strategies, these 4 methods of characterization: description, a character's actions, a character's thoughts or dialogue, and other characters' thoughts or dialogue about that character, and apply them to a sample scene. The specific scene I'm going to have you watch is the opening scene of the 2008 film Iron Man, which centers around the character of Tony Stark. A lot of you may be familiar with Tony Stark if you're one of the millions of people who has seen at least one of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. If you are familiar with this character, I would like you to pretend that you are not. Pretend that you are first meeting this character through this scene, as many people who watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe did. And I'd like you to talk about what you discover about Tony Stark based on this scene. What can we tell about Tony Stark? What can we guess or intuit about him? How well do we know Tony Stark by the end of this scene? I think you'll find that there's a lot of information to work with. So for our discussion post, you'll have questions relating to each of these 4 methods and what using that method has told you about Tony Stark when analyzing this character using this scene. So enjoy the Iron Man clip, enjoy the discussion post, and I will see you in our next video.